Hello everyone. This is Dr. Supriya Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to Banaras Hindu University. I welcome you all to the week 3 lecture number 1 of my course Understanding Deconstruction, a Critical Approach. The topic of today's lecture is Paul Dimon and his key concepts. So, till now, we have dealt upon the key term like deconstruction and how it is different from structuralism and post structuralism, dealing with critics like Ferdinand de Saussure, Roland Barthes, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and in week 2, we have done with the major key concepts of Derrida. Now, here we are going to discuss in the week 3 the major critics who have been influenced by the theory of deconstruction, and we find this theory in their key concepts or in their seminal work. Now, let us come to the overview of Paul Dimon. So, let me tell you that he was born in the year 1919 and he died in the year 1983. He was a Belgium-born literary critic and theorist who became a prominent figure in the development of deconstruction. He is considered as a founder of Yale School of Deconstruction. However, it is to be noted that the Yale School emerged as a group of scholars who shared a common intellectual interest in deconstruction rather than being founded or explicitly organized by any one individual. So, this way, the Yale School particularly refers to a group of literary scholars and critics at Yale University, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, with figures like Jacques Derrida, J.H. Miller, Geoffrey Hartman, and Harold Bloom. Now, coming to discuss how he is different from Jacques Derrida, let me tell you that both Dimon and Jacques Derrida worked with deconstruction, focusing on the instability of language. However, Derrida's approach is more philosophical and abstract, while Dimon's approach is more literary and concrete. So we this way see that when Jacques Derrida basically gave terms which are more philosophical, because he particularly belonged to the stream of philosophy, and therefore he has seen text as philosophy, and he has talked about the instability of meaning, exploring and moving into the text, exploring the meanings and the levels of meanings and deconstructing any fixed meaning. However, when we come to Paul Dimon, we see that Paul Dimon is more literary in his approach because he has dealt with the terms like rhetorical language, he has dealt with allegories and so on. So he seems to be more literary as compared to Derridian philosophical approach. Dimon's theory revolutionized literary criticism, challenging conventional interpretations and emphasizing the role of rhetoric in shaping texts. Now, unlike Derrida, who often emphasizes philosophical concepts like presence, difference, the metaphysics of presence, Dimon focuses down on rhetoric and literary language. He is dealing with inherent contradiction like Derrida, but apart from the contradictions, he pays close attention to how figures of speech, especially metaphor, irony, allegory, they produce internal contradictions in a text. So while both Derrida as well as Dimon are talking about the contradictions in text, we see that the Derridian approach is like finding out difference, finding out the instability because the meaning differs, and so on. Whereas when we come to Paul Dimon, he basically talks of that there are metaphors, there are irony, and there are other figures of speech, and this plays significantly in making the layers of meanings in a text. So he considers that Figures of speech are also responsible for deconstructing meaning. They are not just in order to decorate the text, they are not just in order to refine the text or to make it more literary, rather, they also play significantly in disrupting the meanings. He shows how a metaphor or ironic phrase in a poem or essay can undermine the author's stated message, even without the realization of the author. Now, coming to Demon's work, we see that Paul Demon's important works include Blindness and Insight, which was written in 1971, Allegories of Reading, written in 1979, The Rhetoric of Romanticism, 1984, Aesthetic Ideology, 1988, and so on. So, one by one, we are going to deal with these texts so as to explore what are the key terms or key concepts that he has explored in his critical philosophy or critical thought. Now, coming to the Demon's work, Blindness and Insight. Blindness and Insight is a text that is considered as a foundational text for deconstruction. In this collection of essays, Paul Demon argues that critical insights are often accompanied by a corresponding blindness and that literary texts are paradoxical, creating and undoing meaning through language, a concept he further developed in Allegories of Meaning. However, when we are talking of blindness and insight, we find that it goes on to explore how criticism is based on blindness or blind spot that ironically produces insight. Here, he wants to convey the idea that critics are not only engaged in finding out the blind spots left by the author, rather, critics themselves unknowingly leave so many blind spots, and these are the spots which can be considered as the points or spots or spaces where insights can be developed. The critics' blindness refers, according to Demon, to something they are not aware of in their own analysis, an unconscious contradictions or gap in their reasoning. Ironically, this very blindness becomes the basis of their critical insight. It gives them a space to develop more ideas by filling the gaps. So, this way, blind spots are the areas or the spots which can be developed by filling the gaps, and these are the spots where insights can be further developed or produced. This means that the critics suggest that all critical readings are based on a kind of blindness, a point where the critic fail to see something or is unaware of a deeper contradiction in the text or in their own interpretation, he leaves or creates a gap unknowingly. The critic's understanding doesn't come from straightforward logic, therefore, but rather from a negative movement. This could mean a realization that emerges through doubt, contradiction, or unraveling meaning. It's as if they arrive at insight by realizing what doesn't work or what is missing. This way, there's something underlying and unspoken in the critic's thought that pulls their interpretation away from what they claim to be arguing. Their own language betrays uncertainty or inner conflict, and this way, in short, we can say that it's as though the critic can't even make a firm claim anymore. Their language becomes so self undermining or reflexive that the idea of making a stable, confident argument starts to collapse. So, this way, Demon argues in his Blindness and Insight that critics always give an insight, but in that particular insight, he leaves unknowingly certain blind spots, certain areas which are not completely captured by him, and therefore, this way, these are the areas where he can further develop his insight by filling the gaps. So, these areas of blindness are considered as more important because they are the spaces where insights can be developed further. So, this way, Dieman is describing a kind of deconstructive reading where the critic tries to make a point but ends up revealing that language, meaning, or assertion itself as unstable. Their blind spot is actually what gives depth to their insight, but it also makes every confident assertion shaky or questionable. So, this way, in short, we can say that no idea or no interpretation is complete, because when critic himself is leaving blind spots, and these are the spots where he can develop insight. So every time, even after developing insight, he is again going to leave blind spots. So this way, this process of leaving blind spots and developing by filling the gap is endless, and no meaning or no interpretation therefore is complete. Rather, all the interpretations are shaky. So let us see an example of Dieman's essay, The Rhetoric of Blindness, where he reads Jean-Paul Sartre's book on Marcel Proust. Now, Sartre, as an existentialist, tries to read Proust, who wrote In Search of Lost Time, a book by Proust. So, through the lens of existential freedom, when Sartre is reading Proust, that we create ourselves through our choices. This way, Sartre criticizes Proust for being too deterministic, suggesting that Proust's characters are trapped in memory, history, and involuntary experience. Now, Dieman comes up to say that Sartre's critique of Proust relies on a reading that is itself literary and metaphorical, full of rhetorical moves he doesn't acknowledge himself. So, regarding blindness, we can say that Sartre thinks he is doing philosophy and critique, but he is unconsciously performing the very kind of literary interpretation he criticizes in Proust. Now, regarding insight, Dieman says that the acknowledged use of rhetorical literary tools gives Sartre's analysis its power. It reveals things about Proust that Sartre doesn't fully grasp himself. So, this way we can say that Sartre's blindness, yeah, his failure to see that he is using literary methods, becomes the ground for his insight into Proust's work. That contradiction is what Dieman seizes on. Now, coming to another example, we can take a passage from William Wordsworth's Ode, Intimations of Immortality. And here is a phrase, the child is father of the man. This famous line from Wordsworth expresses the idea that our childhood shapes who we become, that there's a kind of moral or spiritual continuity between the child and the adult. Now, here he exposes the blindness and insight by saying that Wordsworth's insight is that the childhood is meaningful and formative, and therefore he is the father of man, or therefore he leads to making up of man. But his blindness is that in making that claim through metaphor, he opens up a space where meaning slides around, the identities of child and adult becomes unstable. So this way he comes up to clear the idea of how we always get trapped in the blindness and insight. Now, coming to another work, Allegories of Reading, we see that Paul Dieman challenges traditional views of literature and interpretation by showing that reading is inherently unstable and always a form of misreading. He argues that figural language, especially allegory, structures text in ways that prevent stable meaning, revealing the self-referential and undecidable nature of language itself. Through close readings of Rousseau, Nietzsche, Rilke, and Proust, Dieman demonstrates how literary texts expose their own rhetorical contradictions, suggesting that understanding is always provisional and that interpretation must account for the endless play between meaning and misinterpretation. Now, here the main argument that he gives is reading is always a misreading because of too much of rhetorical elements that is present in the text. So, coming to it, we can say that Demon argues that reading is not a straightforward process of uncovering meaning. It's always partial, unstable, and interpretative. Language itself creates so much of ambiguities so that any attempt to find a true meaning is bound to be a misunderstanding or a misreading. So because of rhetorical elements that is present in the text, we always go on finding layers and layers of meanings, but ultimately every meaning or every reading can be considered as a misreading. Metaphors, allegory, and figures of speech are not just decorations, rather, they structure the text as well as after structuring the text, they also produce so many gaps so as to open a text for several interpretations. You can't separate what a text says from how it says. Traditional critics favored symbols, according to Demon, but Demon pushes allegory as it shows division, temporality, and failure of unity. Allegory reveals that meaning unfolds over time and is always fragmentary. Because of allegory, we can interpret a text differently in different time and in different space. So, allegory has its own sense, its own meaning, and it has its own significance. Rather than pointing simply to external truths, language often refers back to itself. According to Demon, language basically is self referential and therefore it refers back to itself. It reveals their own rhetorical nature, exposing the gap between words and meaning. And this way, Demon highlights how texts resist definitive interpretation. The deeper you read, the more the text undoes its own apparent claims. So it is going to deconstruct itself because of these figures of speech. Demon's method resembles deconstruction this way. Closely reading how texts deconstruct their own authority, critics must attend to what the text unconsciously reveals, not just what it consciously states. Now, in short, we can sum up the idea that Demon sees reading as an endless, unstable process because of the figurative language that always undermines simple interpretation. Literature reveals its own failures to mean what it says, and that's the real power of reading. Demon this way applies his reading to authors like Rousseau, Nietzsche, Rilke, and Proust. And he comes up to the idea that literary texts are not vessels of stable meaning, rather, they are sites of conflict between what they say and what they cannot say. The act of reading is about navigating this tension, not resolving it. For example, if we are taking the works of Rousseau, according to Demon, he says that Rousseau is trying to tell the truth about himself in his work Confession. He is telling about his inner life, motives, feelings through his autobiography. You would expect this to be a clear, transparent act of self revelation, but according to Demon, this is something more, something deeper. It is not a transparent delivery of his inner life, motives, and feelings. Rather, when he wants to confess everything honestly, when he wants to lay bare his soul in language, he believes he can translate the inner truth directly into words. But according to Demon, the very act of writing about the self turns experience into narrative, which means selection, shaping, and distortion. And this way, instead of revealing truth, Rousseau creates a version of himself, a self that can't escape figural language, metaphors, and contradictions. And this way, Rousseau, when claims to be sincere, he constantly dramatizes and justifies his actions. He writes as if memory is reliable, but memory itself is figural and unstable, reconstructed, not recorded. So Rousseau's Confessions becomes an allegory of its own failure to fully capture the truth. Now, this way here he want to convey the idea that even when we try to capture what we are feeling, even if we try to write something about our past, then also we are not true to our own self, because our use of the allegories, the use of metaphor, and so on makes things more dramatic, and we are naturally escaping of what we actually wanted to deliver, or what we actually felt, and what actually was our past. So these allegories are playing significantly in dramatizing or in disrupting the actual essence of the originality. Now, in the next slide, we are discussing the rhetoric of Romanticism, where Demon argues that romantic literature is not about a pure celebration of nature or imagination. Rather, it is about the deep, often painful awareness that language can never fully capture human experience, and that poetry exposes this failure at its core. For example, in Wordsworth's ode Intimations of Immortality, the poet tries to recapture a lost childhood sense of wonder, that feeling when everything seemed sacred and luminous. At first, Wordsworth suggests that memory and poetry can recover the lost vision, but as the poem unfolds, he starts to admit that no matter how beautiful the language, the original experience, but it cannot be truly regained. Poetry becomes a kind of compensation, a substitute, and not the real thing. Therefore, poetry is something that is much away or diverted from the real experience. Demon therefore says that language of poetry, particularly, doesn't preserve the experience, rather, it replaces it. The more Wordsworth tried to immortalize childhood through language, the more he reveals the gap between lived experience and the words that attempt to express it. And therefore, ultimately, here he tries to convey the idea that the language of poetry is unable to capture the real life, because, according to him, language somewhat fails to capture the real essence or the reality. Now, in the next work, Aesthetic Ideology, we see that Demon argues about aesthetic. According to him, aesthetic, or the ideas of beauty, form, harmony, is not neutral or pure, rather, it's an ideology, meaning a system of illusions we believe in. So, this is again a very much similar concept, where he is trying to say that the beauty outside is something that is quite vast, and language fails to capture it completely. So, when we think aesthetic experiences offer truth or moral value, but actually they mask contradictions and distract from reality. Now, coming to the most controversial idea about Demon, we see that it is in 1987 we come to have an evidence that Demon had written for German controlled newspapers during World War II, and this led to a significant controversy and scrutiny of his work and reputations. Paul Demon is not only a central figure in the literary theory, but also a deeply controversial one this way, mainly because of revelations about his past involvement with pro Nazi journalism during World War II. It is in 1987, after Demon's death, a scholar named Otwin de Graaf uncovered that Demon had written over 170 articles for a pro Nazi collaborationist newspaper in Belgium. and the name of the newspaper was Le Soir between 1940 and 1942 during the Nazi occupation. Now, most of the articles were cultural commentary, literary criticism, or book reviews, but one article in particular, titled The Jews in Contemporary Literature, was explicitly anti Semitic, and in it, Demon suggested that Jewish writers had a negative influence on European literature and that removing them wouldn't be a loss. Now, this revelation caused a huge scandal in academia circle, especially since Demon was a key figure in Yale deconstruction alongside thinkers like Jacques Derrida. Critics assumed him of hypocrisy since his later work focused on exposing the hidden ideologies in text, yet he never acknowledged or reflected on his own early involvement in fascist ideology. However, supporters tried to contextualize his actions, arguing that he was just 20 at the time and perhaps he was possibly trying to survive in occupied Belgium, and that his later work radically broke with the ideology of his youth. And Derrida himself wrote a long, dense defense trying to explain Demon's silence on the issue and appeal to separate Demon's biography from his theory. Thank you.